Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C., April 14, 1865. The war is almost over. The president is laughing. And then John Wilkes Booth pulls a single-shot Derringer from his coat pocket, steps into the presidential box, and fires. Lincoln slumps. Mary Todd screams. Major Henry Rathbone lunges at the assassin and gets a knife blade across his arm for the effort. Booth vaults over the railing, catches his spur on a bunting of decorative flags, and crashes onto the stage below, fracturing a bone in his left leg. He staggers upright in front of nearly 1,000 witnesses, raises his knife above his head, and shouts something. Here is what the official record says he shouted: "Sic semper tranits, thus always to tyrants," the old Virginia state motto. Dramatic, clean, satisfying as a historical caption. Here is what the official record omits. The witnesses could not agree. Not then, not in the weeks that followed, not in the sworn depositions collected by the government. Some heard one phrase, some heard another. Some heard both in different orders. Some heard a third phrase that almost nobody talks about anymore. And the men and women who were most insistent about what they heard. The ones who kept correcting the record. The ones who wrote letters, gave interviews, lobbied newspapers. They had a strange habit of dying before anyone listened to them. Joseph Stewart, the attorney who chased Booth across the stage that night, gave a detailed account of what he heard and later revised it under circumstances that were never fully explained. William Withers, Jr., the orchestra leader who was nearly run over by Booth in the wings, wrote a memoir decades later in which his account shifted in a way that has troubled historians ever since. Laura Keene, the celebrated actress who cradled the dying president's head in her lap, gave at least 3 different versions of what she heard Booth say. And the most inflammatory of those versions, the one she apparently shared privately with a journalist, was never published during her lifetime. She died in 1873. The journalist died the following year. The notes from their conversation have never been found. We are going to follow that thread all the way to the end. Because what John Wilkes Booth said in the moment after he killed Abraham Lincoln is not a settled question. It is an open wound in the American record. And the people who tried to close it properly kept getting in the way of a story that certain institutions needed to remain simple. By the time this is over, you will understand that the confusion around Booth's words was not an accident of chaos. It was, in at least some measure, a product of deliberate selection. Let's start with the man at the center of it. Not Booth, not Lincoln. The man who was standing closest to the stage when Booth landed. His name was James Tanner. He was 22 years old, a former Union corporal who had lost both legs below the knee at the Second Battle of Bull Run. He attended the performance at Ford's Theater on the evening of April 14th because a friend had offered him a spare ticket. He was seated in the orchestra section. He had a clear view of the stage. Tanner was not a complicated man in 1865. He was a stenographer by training, one of the best in Washington, by all accounts, and he worked with the kind of meticulous, literal precision that his profession demanded. Because when the government needed a stenographer to record the depositions of witnesses in the hours immediately after Lincoln was shot, they sent for James Tanner. He spent the night transcribing testimony. He heard what the witnesses said about what Booth said. All of them, in sequence, under oath. And when those transcripts were collected by the War Department, Tanner kept his own set of notes. He wrote to a friend the following day, a letter that survives in a fragmented form in the archives of the New York Historical Society. In 15 minutes I had testimony enough to hang Wilkes Booth higher than Hammond. But there were things said in that room that I could not put in my notes because I was told not to. Told by whom? The letter does not say. But James Tanner spent the next 3 decades asking that question out loud, and the answer was never officially given. Now let's go back to the stage. Let's slow down and stand in the smoke and the screaming and try to understand exactly what happened in those first seconds after the shot. The Derringer fired at approximately 10:15 in the evening. The sound was described by witnesses in the orchestra section as less like a gunshot and more like a sharp crack, smaller than expected, swallowed almost immediately by the size of the theater. Many people in the audience did not immediately understand what had happened. Some thought it was part of the play. Others thought something had fallen from the rigging. Major Rathbone, seated in the box with Lincoln and Mary Todd, was the first to react. He grabbed at Booth. Booth slashed him with a long knife and pushed him back. Then Booth stepped to the front of the box railing, looked down at the audience, which was beginning to process the reality of what it was, witnessing, and he made a declaration. What that declaration was is where everything falls apart. The version recorded in most textbooks goes like this. Booth shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," as he jumped, possibly before he jumped, possibly as he landed. Some accounts add a second phrase, "The South is avenged." Some accounts replace the Latin entirely. A smaller number record a different phrase altogether, "Revenge for the South." And then there are the accounts, fewer in number but remarkable in their specificity, that suggest Booth said something else first, something more personal, something that wasn't a political proclamation at all. Harry Hawk was the actor performing on stage at the moment Booth landed. He was the only former in the scene, and he had the stage to himself. He was perhaps 15 feet from Booth when Booth hit the boards. In his initial statement to investigators, Hawk said he could not clearly make out what Booth shouted because of the noise in the house. In a letter written approximately 2 weeks later to his family in Philadelphia, Hawk described the moment differently. He said, "Booth appeared to look directly upward toward Lincoln's box before he moved toward the wings, and that what he said in that moment was not what I later told the men from the government, because they seemed very set on what they wanted it to be." Why would investigators be very set on a particular version of what Booth said? That is a question worth holding on to, because the answer suggests that the War Department under Edwin Stanton had an interest in a specific narrative, and that narrative required Booth's words to be legible, political, and uncomplicated. Sic semper tyrannis is a political statement. It places Booth firmly in the tradition of Republican tyrannicide. It makes him comprehensible as a Confederate sympathizer acting on ideological conviction. It closes the story, a more personal statement, something addressed to Lincoln directly, something that referenced names or arrangements or prior knowledge. Opens the story back up. It raises questions about what Booth knew, who he had spoken to, and whether the act was as purely individual as the official account required it to be. This is where James Tanner comes back in. Tanner's own account of Booth's words, in the testimony he gave and revised over the years, was notably inconsistent with itself, in a way that suggested not faulty memory but external pressure. In an 1886 speech before the Grand Army of the Republic, Tanner stated publicly that the depositions taken on the night of April 14th contained material that was seen by the Secretary of War and never seen again by any other living man. The full original stenographic notes from the Peterson House depositions. Tanner's notes are not in the National Archives. They are listed as having been transferred to the War Department in April of 1865. After that, the chain of custody disappears. A request filed in the early 20th century by a researcher named Otto Eisenschimmel was met with a response indicating that no such notes could be located. They have not been located since. So we have Tanner, a trained stenographer with a professional mandate for accuracy, telling us that something was said in those depositions that was deliberately excluded. We have his original notes missing from the Federal Archive. And we have a series of eyewitnesses whose accounts of Booth's exact words were collected, summarized, and in several cases appear to have been selectively rendered. Laura Keene was the most famous performer in the theater that night. She was backstage when the shot fired, and she came onto the stage as Booth was, exiting into the wings. In her first public statement, she said she heard Booth shout, "Sic semper tyrannis," and then something she described as a second utterance that could not fully distinguish. She did not elaborate publicly, but Keene spoke to other people privately. One of them was a journalist named Adam Badeau, and Keene apparently told him, in some detail, what she believed the second utterance contained. Badeau prepared a piece based on this conversation. The piece was not published. Badeau left the paper within the year. Laura Keene died in 1873 without having made any further public statement about what she heard. Her personal papers were held by her daughter. When researchers sought access, the daughter indicated that a portion of them had been removed for safekeeping by a representative of an unnamed organization following Keene's death. The remaining papers passed through several private hands before a portion was donated to the Library of Congress. The donation inventory lists several items as not present at time of accession that were referenced in earlier correspondence about the collection. Joseph Stewart was the Washington attorney who leapt from his seat and ran after Booth, as Booth fled across the stage and out the rear door to the alley. Stewart was fast. He nearly caught Booth. In his immediate statement, he described what Booth said from the stage in terms consistent with the Six Semper account. But Stewart was a lawyer. He wrote things down in a personal journal that passed through his estate to a Virginia law library. There is an entry dated 3 weeks after the assassination, describing a meeting with a representative of the War Department. The entry reads, "He made clear what account was expected of me, and I understood that to deviate from it would bring difficulties I was not prepared for." The journal is accessible. It has been cited in at least 2 academic papers. Neither paper received significant attention. Stewart lived until 1894. He did not publicly revise his account, but in the last years of his life he gave a series of interviews in which he repeatedly said, "The story of that night is not complete." He died before the interviewer could press him on what he meant. William Withers, Jr. was the orchestra leader. He was in the wings, near the stage door, when Booth came running through. In his 1901 memoir, Withers wrote about the night of the assassination at some length. The account differs from 1865 in one specific and notable way. Booth is described as having paused and said something directly to Withers, addressed to him personally, before running out the door. Withers does not reproduce the exact words. He describes them only as words I have carried for 40 years and chosen not to repeat, because I do not think the world is yet prepared for what they imply about the nature of that evening. By the time the memoir was published, Withers was elderly. He died 3 years later. No interviewer apparently thought to ask him directly what those words were. Are you beginning to see the shape of this? Hawke, unable to say clearly what he heard. Keene, with a second utterance she described privately but never publicly. Stewart told what account was expected of him. Withers, carrying words for 40 years. Tanner, watching his transcripts disappear into the War Department and spending 30 years noting their absence. Each of these people adds something. A sensory detail, a suggestion of personal yes, a hint of content that goes beyond political theater. And each of them either died before the full story could be extracted, or remained silent in ways that suggest they understood the cost of speaking. The researcher who came closest to assembling these pieces into a coherent argument was Otto Eisenschimmel, a chemist by training who spent decades investigating the Lincoln assassination as a serious historical pursuit. In his 1937 book, Why Was Lincoln Murdered?, Eisenschimmel examined the available eyewitness testimony and the structural anomalies of the investigation with a rigor that earned him both credibility and considerable institutional hostility. His central argument was not that Booth was innocent, but that Booth was not alone. That the assassination was enabled by a network of at least tacit supporters within the federal government. Eisenschimmel was dismissed by the academic establishment. His source materials were donated to a university library after his death. When a subsequent researcher attempted to access those materials in the 1980s, a portion was described as unavailable for review. The reclassification was performed without any documented explanation. Eisenschimmel also noted that the official record of what Booth said was not established by the weight of eyewitness consensus. It was established in large part by a single newspaper account published within hours of the assassination, before any formal compilation of witness testimony had been conducted. That account was published in the Washington Evening Star. The reporter who wrote it is identified only by initials. No full name has ever been definitively matched to those initials. The article was then reprinted across dozens of newspapers in the days that followed. By the time witnesses began to offer contradictory accounts, the sic semper version was already lodged in the national consciousness. Subsequent contradictions looked like confusion, not correction. Here is what the record says. Booth shouted sic semper tyrannis, and perhaps the South is avenged, and this was heard by hundreds of witnesses, and it is a settled matter. Here is what the record omits. The conflicting testimonies, the personal communications of witnesses describing different words, the War Department's management of witness statements, the missing Tanner transcripts, and the long line of people who suggested, in private and in their final years, that the full story of those words had never been told. And then there is the question of what Booth was actually seeking to communicate. Because Booth was above all else a man of the theater, he had planned this moment for months. He had written about it in his diary, the diary that the government took from his body at Garrett's farm in April 1865, and that arrived in federal custody with pages missing. 18 pages of John Wilkes Booth's diary were missing when it was finally produced as evidence at the conspiracy trial. The government said the pages had been missing when the diary was found. The detective who found it, Everton Conger, said it had been intact. Those pages have never been recovered. The diary that does survive contains entries in which Booth writes about his motives, his grievances, his sense of historical destiny. He writes about Lincoln with a specific, intimate contempt that goes beyond political ideology. He writes in the voice of a man who believed he was delivering a message, not just a political statement, but a personal reckoning. A man who would have had more than one thing to say in the moment of delivery. Which brings us back to the stage, to the smoke and the screaming. To Booth, standing upright on the boards with a broken leg, looking out at the audience, raising his knife. What exactly did he say? The disproportionate institutional response to that question. The management of testimonies, the missing transcripts, the disappearance of private correspondence, the reclassification of research materials, suggests that what Booth said was understood to be dangerous, not dramatically dangerous, not the danger of an embarrassing discrepancy in a history book, the danger of a thread that, if pulled, would unravel the version of events that the government of the United States needed the American people to accept. A lone actor, an isolated fanatic, a Confederate sympathizer operating from personal obsession. That story works if Booth's words were purely ideological. Sic semper tyrannis is an ideology. It closes the door on further inquiry. But the secondary utterances, the ones Keene described privately, the ones Withers carried for 40 years, the ones Stewart was told to omit, if they named names or referenced arrangements, would not close any doors. They would open every door in the building. The Bureau of Military Justice, which conducted the conspiracy trial in the spring of 1865, operated under the authority of Edwin Stanton. Stanton controlled what evidence was presented, which witnesses were called, what questions were asked. The 8 defendants in the conspiracy trial were convicted largely on the basis of their physical participation in the plot. The deeper question of who had motivated, funded, or enabled the plot was not pursued with the same intensity. Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt, who prosecuted the case, had access to all the investigative material. Holt and Stanton were in close communication throughout. Holt died in 1894. Stanton died in 1869. Whatever they knew about what Booth said went with them, unless it didn't. There is a document that surfaces periodically in discussions of the Lincoln assassination, claimed by various researchers to be a fragment of the Tanner transcripts, or a copy of testimony excluded from the official record. It has appeared in private collections, been offered for sale, been authenticated by some examiners and dismissed by others. Its provenance is murky. Its contents reportedly include a reference to a statement about Booth's words that goes significantly beyond the sic semper account. This document has never been conclusively authenticated. It has also never been conclusively debunked. The named academic who examined it most closely subsequently declined to publish a full analysis and described his decision as a professional judgment. He did not elaborate further, and the preliminary note is difficult to find in most academic databases, where it appears to have been indexed under a variant title that separates it from related searches. This is what institutional suppression looks like when it is functioning at low intensity. It does not require agents and orders and dramatic interventions. It requires only the steady application of professional pressure, a word from an editor, a suggestion from a department chair, a reclassification in a catalog, applied consistently over time. It requires only that the easy version remain easy and the difficult version remain difficult to reach. You have now heard about James Tanner, whose transcripts vanished into the War Department. About Harry Hawk, who told his family privately that investigators wanted a specific version of events. About Laura Keene, whose most candid account was shared with a journalist whose article was never published and whose papers arrived at the Library of Congress missing items. About Joseph Stewart, who wrote in his own journal that a War Department representative told him what account was expected. About William Withers, who carried words for 40 years and took them to his grave. About Otto Eisenschimmel, whose research materials were reclassified after his death into a form that made them harder to find. About Booth's diary, which arrived in federal custody with 18 pages already gone. Here is the question that none of these facts individually can answer, but that all of them together demand you ask. If what Booth said in that moment was exactly what the official record says, a political slogan, nothing more, then why did so many people who were standing close enough to hear it spend the rest of their lives suggesting, privately and cautiously, that the full story had never been told? Why would a War Department official tell a witness what account was expected of him if the account required no management? Why would 18 pages disappear from the diary of the man who fired the shot if those pages contained nothing that needed to be hidden? Why would the stenographic notes from the most consequential deposition session in American history not be in the National Archives? You have been handed a thread. You did not ask for it. But you have it now, in the same way that James Tanner had it when he walked out of the Peterson house in the gray early hours of April 15, 1865, with notes he would never see again, and knowledge he spent 30 years trying to make someone hear. The people who tried to speak fully about what happened in Ford's Theater that night had careers interrupted, papers lost, accounts managed, and voices quietly retired. They were not silenced with violence, or at least, that is what the record says. What the record omits is a full accounting of what they knew, why their most candid statements were made privately rather than publicly, and what exactly Booth said before he ran into the dark. That night has an official ending. It ends with sic semper tyrannis echoing in a Washington theater, and a president dying across the street, and a clean, closed story about a lone assassin and his political conviction. But the witnesses who were there, the ones who were close enough to feel the air from his coat as he ran past them, they knew it wasn't quite that clean. They tried, in the ways available to them, to say so. The thread is still there. The question is still open, and now you are carrying it too.